when you
not.
say he was known as an evangelist, what does that mean? When you said he was known as an evangelist?
He was known among his buddies and his friends as a person to arrange for their annual evangelical services, 2 weeks of preaching or something like that. He would preach in another man's church day and night and go back to his church when it was over. That was a very common method, and you'd want as good a preacher as you could get to come in so that people would come, and out of that was some new people would join the church. Most of the people joined the church and were baptized during a revival meeting. And so they needed a visiting preacher. The preacher who was there was giving it all he had every Sunday. But if they could get someone to come in on Sunday afternoon and start them a revival, they'd announce it, publicize it, and he would go back to the same churches lots of times that he'd been in before. And made lifetime friends out of some of those people who were not in his church, but were in the churches where he held revivals, such as Jonas Ridge and other places right in the mountains. Some of them were stretched out into the seacoast, but he loved to preach. He particularly loved to see someone respond to an invitation that he made from the pulpit. If he made an invitation and people came down in response to be dedicate their lives and rededicate their lives, if all of that happened, then it got hold of him. He felt the presence of God and the guiding of God, and always he felt that it was the most important thing that in his life was his relationship to Christ. And that's the thing that caused him to go into the ministry. I'm sure the preachers coming into his church as evangelists had something to do with it too.
I'm going to stand up and let you look at me. Yeah, I like this. Look at me. That's better. I want to get some light in your eyes because we're sitting down. I don't want you to look up that much. Look about right. If I sit like this and you're looking at me, that's a little better. That's the reflection. Let's just go back to the way we were.
Okay.
Try to just lean back just a little bit because I want to see your eyes. Yeah, that's great. So what would you say if you had to say 2 or 3 things that you and your father had in common as far as your beliefs in God and your styles of preaching, and maybe a couple things that you probably are different in? What are some? Start off with that. What do you think are some of the things that was different about the way you were a preacher and the way he was a preacher?
Well, I'm sure there wasn't any influence on my life greater than his influence, and there were some strengths that he had that I prayed for and worked for and believed highly in, and that was the revival meeting style. That we have a service and have a call to the altar, and his preaching and my preaching were the very similar. At this point, we used stories and illustrations to impress a point on the congregation. Some of the very meaningful experiences of Christian people, how their lives were changed by the presence of Christ. and to use these illustrations that I have heard maybe someone else say, or read in John Wesley's life, or someone. There are, just in the world of nature, there are stories that emphasize what happens in the physical life also happens in the spiritual life. God is manipulating, or that's not quite, he's influencing, let's say. God is influencing our lives by the amount that we will yield our lives to him and be dedicated to Christ and Christ's teachings and the kind of ministry that Christ carried on. And Christ used a lot of stories. That was an interesting thing that my father never forgot, and neither have I forgotten. That stories about the power of God in an individual's life was one of the ways that Jesus preached. It was one of the ways that John Wesley preached. He felt that there was a power in that kind of preaching. And my father would talk about that. He felt sort of possessed when he was preaching. And all of the sickness I tell about in my career, I've never missed many Sundays preaching because of sickness. It's amazing. Of course, most of my sickness came before I was a preacher, but for years I never missed a Sunday. And
Me either.
right. But Alice has been a great influence in my life too, and it's hard to put your finger on, but she, I think, had something to do with my staying well. God used her to keep me going with major operations, things of that sort, without having to miss any preaching much. Until I retired, I've been crippled up more since retirement than I was when I was preaching. Now, I left this whole story a little while ago about moving to Durham.
Well, let's hold on that.
Okay.
I want to talk about this stuff. We can talk about